There are many things that need to be done in these communities, and many people, whether it be the government or nonprofits or others, need to play their role. I'm just focusing on one sliver of it, which I think is an important and catalytic sliver, which is creating more jobs and more economic growth in more places. As I do think that's one way, at least I can contribute to trying to knit together a very divided country and giving the country the best possible shot of continuing to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, even as we're seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship. There's reasons to be concerned that maybe this next 250 years won't be as strong as the last 250 years. But rather than just sit back and complain about it or worry about it, I figured I'll do at least my part to do something about it. And for me, that's focused on Rise of the Rest.
It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome to the podcast one of America's, nay, the world's great entrepreneurs, founder of AOL, Revolution, and Rise of the Rest, and best-selling author of the brand new book, The Rise of the Rest, How Entrepreneurs in Surprising Places Are Building the American Dream, Steve Case. Welcome, Steve.
Andrew, great to be with you. We've been on this journey together for a decade, and it's great to continue the journey, continue the dialogue.
Heck yeah, man. So you and I became friends when we were both on the National Advisory Council for Innovation Entrepreneurship that you were the chair of. We were both presidential ambassadors of global entrepreneurship. We hung out in Cincinnati, Ohio, when we were both there for a mayor's summit. And you are singular in American life, in my opinion, as being one of the I'm going to use the B word, one of the billionaire entrepreneurs who's championed cities that really were not hubs for innovation or entrepreneurship or growth companies. And you freaking picked up that banner now about a decade ago when you were leading Startup America. What the heck got you into the revitalizing America business?
Well, first of all, when you were talking, I was just thinking, I was at a Rise of the Rest event in DC the week you resigned from Venture for America, and we were walking together into the event, and I said, "What are you going to do next?" And there was a long pause, and you looked at me and said, "I think I'm going to run for president because I want to elevate universal basic income." And I was like, wow, I had no idea. So I think I was one of the first people in the country, other than perhaps your family, to know what you were up to. And I give you great credit for jumping into that race and obviously getting a lot of traction and elevating that issue of really trying to deal with a pretty significant income inequality issue. So, but going to your question, I got into this, like many things, a little bit by accident. It was not something I was, kind of intending to do. And it goes back to exactly your introduction. When I was asked to lead that National Advisory Council on Innovation Entrepreneurship, I think it was 11 or 12 years ago. I, like most people, were a little skeptical. What is this, kind of going to do? A lot of things in DC, groups come together and write reports and they sit on shelves. And so I'm sure, like you, was a little skeptical, but we did get some traction, and some of the things that we focused on, like trying to get more capital to entrepreneurs, trying to celebrate entrepreneurs, led to things like the White House Startup America effort that President Obama asked me to lead, and then led to things like the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, Jobs Act, which passed about 10 years ago. And to me, that whole process and that series of things opened my eyes to something that I hadn't fully understood. Number one was that most jobs in this country are created by new companies. Small business is very important. Big business is very important. But new business, companies under 5 years, is really most important. I didn't fully appreciate that. And I also didn't fully appreciate that venture capital was basically going to a few cities. That over the last decade, 75% of venture capital has gone to just three states: California, New York, and Massachusetts. And so when you put those two things together, it doesn't take, you have to be a rocket scientist to say, okay, if most of the new jobs are created by new companies, and most of the successful new companies that really create lots and lots of jobs do raise venture capital, but venture capital is overwhelmingly just going to a few states, we have a problem here. And how do we address that? How do we level the playing field? How do we create more companies in more places that can create more jobs in more places? And so that led us to launch the Rise the Rest bus tours 8 years ago. We did a series of those tours, visited 44 cities. That led us about 5 years ago to take the next step of launching the Rise the Rest Fund to back entrepreneurs. So far, we've backed 200 companies in 100 different cities. And that led more recently to writing this book, because after spending this decade traveling the country, I thought the stories of these entrepreneurs were remarkable. The renewal of these cities was both surprising and gratifying. And I didn't think it was a story that was told. Most people do not realize what's happening in all these different cities. So that's a long answer to a short question, but that's how we got to now.
I mean, you say it so casually, man, but that's 10 years of your life. It's 10 years of work.
So it's been fun. It's been fun.
So you grew up, I want to say, in Hawaii. I believe you went to the same high school that Barack Obama did, but then you also spent some time in the Midwest. You live in the Virginia area now. So you're kind of, I suppose, from different parts of America that have given you a different perspective. You're the chair of the Smithsonian, I believe, which might be the most American institution that there is. Where do you think you got this affinity for trying to have opportunities arise in different places?
Well, it's a good question. I've reflected on that, even writing the book. And you're right, I did grow up in Hawaii. My parents both were born and raised in Hawaii, so our family goes back there over 100 years. I did go to high school with President Obama. I was actually a senior when he was a freshman, so we didn't have classes together, but I do remember playing basketball with him.
Did you haze him? I'm kidding.
No, I didn't. And I would say everybody in the school probably had, at best, modest expectations how we would both turn out. So I think we were positive surprises in terms of what ended up happening.
Me too, for what it's worth.
No one marked to the club
teenage Andrew for greatness.
People with low expectations and would not have made the most likely to succeed list by anybody in high school. So when I graduated from, I did go to college in Massachusetts, and then my first job out of college was in Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then my second job was for Pizza Hut in Wichita, Kansas, where I was the director of new pizza development. At the time, it was owned by PepsiCo. And then after a little bit of time there, I moved to the Northern Virginia area outside of Washington, D.C. To join a startup that was doing something that I thought was pretty interesting. But that company failed. So I was kind of welcome to the world of startups. Sometimes they work, often they don't. But thankfully, two of the people I met, and I ended up starting America Online AOL in 1985. And that was certainly the early days of the internet. Then only 3% of people were online. They're only on an hour a week. And for a decade or so, the skepticism about whether the internet would ever amount to anything was pretty strong. But eventually, after about 10 years, we kind of broke through. I do think some of that, to your question, some of my experience growing up in a place like Hawaii, living in places like Ohio and Kansas and then Virginia, helped give me a sense of these places and appreciation for these places, but also recognizing some of the challenges in those places. And also starting and scaling AOL in Northern Virginia. I think at the time, there was no venture capital in Northern Virginia. There were not really any startups in Northern Virginia. It was really a government town because it was outside of Washington, D.C. And so it was a struggle to raise capital. It was a struggle to hire people. It was a struggle to get people to believe in us and pay attention to us. I think that also helps inform my thinking. So that backstory, combined with what I mentioned before, my eyes being opened a decade ago to some of both the problems we had, but some of the opportunities we have, I think kind of led me on this path to say, well, I do have the ability to thankfully to kind of be a change agent. Rather than enter politics like you did, I want to focus on policy in a
You're wise, my friend. You're
bipartisan way.
wise.
Things like things like the Jobs Act,
Gene is grateful.
and I also want to do what I can to try to level the playing field so the people in places that do feel left behind have more of a shot, and the communities all across the country can start creating jobs and being part of the future. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this work, and that led me to write the book to share some of these stories.
Yeah, you and I intersected around 2011, 2012. So I started Venture for America in some ways from the opposite end, which is the talent spectrum. That there was this
Right.
brain drain out of the Midwest and the South to the coasts, Wall Street, consulting, law, and eventually tech. And so I thought, look, we should create a pathway for enterprising aspiring entrepreneurs to be able to link up with startups in Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Baltimore, New Orleans, Birmingham. So I started it in 2011. It was around the same time you were turning your sights this way. One reason why I admire
Right.
you so much is that I did that work for 6.5 years. And reading your book was such a joy because I actually know a lot of the people, know a lot of the characters. Like I got to see some of the companies actually take flight over the last 5 or 6 years. And one of the things you say in your book, which I thought was very, very powerful, you said two things. I'll present them both to you. One you said is that, look, government has a role to play, but it can't be government that rejuvenates a lot of these communities. Like there are other things that have to be done. And then the second thing you say is that that the lack of growth and opportunity in different parts of the country is driving disunity. Now, these are both things that I agree with, and I wanted to just unpack either or both with you. Where I totally agree with you that the government, even though I'm now something of a political guy, like I don't think the government can do it all, and that there are all these other pieces to the puzzle. So, like, what do you see as the primary engines outside of government?
Well, first of all, I do, and I talk about some of this in the book. I do think there is a role for government, both at the national
Yeah.
level and more of the local level. And so things like the Jobs Act 10 years ago make sense. Things like as part of the Chips and Science Act, kind of authorizing $10 billion of funding for regional hubs makes sense. Things like in the Inflation Reduction Act, some funding around climate technologies to accelerate the investment in sort of the sustainability, I think makes sense. Trying to hopefully soon, get immigration reform so we can continue to win what's now a global battle for talent makes sense. And then at more of a state and local level, having governors focus less on economic development as being an effort to lure big companies to move their headquarters or open a factory, and more on launching new companies someday, some of which can become big companies, makes sense. And having mayors really focus on and celebrate what entrepreneurs are doing, makes sense. So there are a lot of things that the government can and should do to kind of set the table, kind of set the ground rules, create a fertile environment for innovation and entrepreneurship to flourish everywhere. But ultimately, it does come down to the entrepreneur with the idea. Ultimately, it does come down to investors, backing and supporting that. And that's where the work you were doing with VFA on the talent side, and what we've been doing on the capital side, are critically important. And as you know, completely linked. That part of the
Complementary,
reason
totally.
there has been a brain
Yeah.
drain, and people growing up in different parts of the country, even going to some of our great universities in Michigan or Ohio or Pennsylvania or other places, and then leaving those places to go to places like Silicon Valley, is because there wasn't much opportunity there. And some of that was because there wasn't much investment capital, kind of there. So if you can create more of a sense of possibility and have more capital, that should slow the brain drain of people leaving and create a boomerang of people returning. And there are a couple things that have happened in the last decade that I think are super encouraging. We did a report with PitchBook last year, and in the last decade, 1,400 new venture firms have started in rise of the rest cities, meaning
Yeah,
outside of San
incredible.
Francisco, outside of New York, outside of 1,400. So now there are venture firms in many places that didn't exist a decade ago. And there is a six-fold increase in investment dollars going to these rise of rest cities. So we're making progress, and we had made steady progress in the last each of the years in the last decade. But clearly, the pandemic was a tipping point, an accelerant in terms of more people deciding to move to other places, investors who could
Yep.
suddenly meet entrepreneurs via pitch meetings, being able to do that. So we're now trying to capitalize on that. I think this next 5 or 10 years, people are going to be really surprised by how many significant companies, some of which dozens of which actually I profile in the book, are going to launch
Yep.
and scale in places that are going to surprise people and going to create lots of jobs. In Detroit, I know you're passionate about Detroit. I was there last week. Two companies we backed there, Shinola and StockX, neither existed 10 years ago. Both now have more than 1,000 employees in Detroit, which just shows you and
Awesome.
both have significant valuation. So it shows you this is possible. It really is working. We just need to be intentional about not just backing the same kind of people in the same kind of places.
Well, you put your money where your mouth is, Steve. Where the Rise of the Rest Fund, I believe it's 150 million. You've been investing in dozens of these companies, maybe hundreds. And I'm going to share a story for everyone that's good fun. So people listening to this probably know the healthy food chain Sweet Greens, in which you're an investor. One of the meetings we had, you hosted us in a Sweet Greens for dinner,
In
and
Palo Alto.
they're yeah, and it was like a fancy Sweet Greens meal, which was delightful. And I think we even had a little Shinola gift for us at the tails. And I have a
Correct.
Shinola watch. I
Shinola
don't
was
have it
right
on
next
my
door.
body right now. Yeah, so it was it was your vision come to life, and that's one reason I admire you so much is that like you don't talk about stuff, you actually just go out and do it. And what you're trying to do is cultivate the next generation of doers around the country. Your last book, The Third Wave, talked about how you thought the biggest opportunities were going to be this union between mature industries or maybe upstarts in those industries like agriculture or
Mm.
logistics, as you detail in this book, and then technology was going to wind up being the enabler, which made sense to me as someone who spent a lot of time in these environments, because each of these cities typically has some kind of industrial base that throws off expertise that is distinct to that community.
Yeah, totally agree. And first of all, the funds, we've now done two funds. It's a $250 million fund, so $300 million total. We've backed 200 companies in 100 cities. And I did put my money where my mouth is because I anchor each of those funds. But I also want to point out that we got several dozen other individuals who are prominent entrepreneurs and investors to join us on this. So some of our investors in the Rise of the Rest Fund include Jeff Bezos and Howard Schultz and Sarah Blakely and Tory Burch and venture investors like John Doerr and Jim Breyer and private equity folks like Henry Kravis and David Rubenstein, and hedge fund people like Ray Dalio, and families around the country, including the Walton family, the Koch family. A lot of people have joined us on this. So I want to make it clear that this isn't just about me. It's a team of people that's trying to identify promising entrepreneurs and back them in these Rise of the Rest kind of cities. But you're totally right. This issue of expertise, domain expertise about particular sectors, I think is underappreciated in terms of what I think will happen in this next decade of innovation. As you know, these Rise of the Rest cities, there's some advantages they have. Cost of living is lower, cost of operations lower. If you're able to raise $1 million, it might go 2 or 3 times further than if you're in San Francisco or New York. So those are advantages. There are also some lifestyle advantages in many of these cities, amenities that people like. For some family dynamics that are encouraging. Yeah. For some tax incentives might be a factor. But perhaps the biggest factor is exactly what you said: the strategic value of being in that city, and that was different than what we've seen in the last decade. I'll just give you a couple examples. There's a company we backed in Chattanooga, Tennessee called FreightWaves that's built a platform kind of like Bloomberg for the trucking and logistics industry. I didn't know this till we were there with our Rise Rest bus, but some of the biggest trucking companies in the country are headquartered in Chattanooga. So if you're building Bloomberg for trucking, better to be in Chattanooga than to be in Manhattan or Silicon Valley. Another one that is interesting is a company called Acre Trader in Northwest Arkansas in Fayetteville. the founder of that company, Carter Malloy, actually was in San Francisco working for a hedge fund in San Francisco when he came up with the idea of Acre Trader, which is a platform to allow people to invest in farmland. Uh, he decided he'd be better off being in Arkansas, closer to the farmers, in order to convince farmers to put their farms on his platform. And so he moved there, and it scaled quite significantly. And again, he thought an advantage to be in Arkansas as opposed to be in California. So there are more and more of these examples of entrepreneurs who are really leveraging what's unique about their city, unique about their region, to build companies that are going to be advantaged because they're there, as opposed to what has been historic, which is kind of disadvantaged because they're not in Silicon Valley. They don't have access to capital. They don't have access to the talent. And that's why I think this rise of the rest phenomenon is going to really accelerate over the next decade. And that's why I wrote the book, because I really wanted people to be aware of what's happening and have a sense of where the puck was going.
Reading about these companies was a lot of fun. Some of them uplifting and invigorating. I loved the stories of 75F, which is trying to keep office buildings a certain temperature, which, by the way, is incredibly good for energy efficiency and the climate. I think commercial buildings are the fourth biggest emitters or consumers of energy.
Right.
So if you could eliminate the waste, it's incredible. AppHarvest, which I believe was an indoor farming company that's based in Kentucky, where they're experiencing job loss from coal miners. And you make the correct observation that, look, when someone talks about retraining in these environments, there is the open question: retrain for what? Retrain for which employer? Because right. when you go to those communities, they used to have one employer, let's say a coal mine, and then if you say, "Hey guys, great news, we're going to give you certificates in something else," they'll look around and be like, "What am I going to do with this certificate?" So that the fact that a company like AppHarvest actually is making a farm that can produce, what was it, 20, 30 times as much food as that area of square.
Yeah, Jonathan Webb started this company just 5 or 6 years ago, and we were the initial seed investor. It's now scaled up to actually a public company, and he's created more than 500 jobs in this area outside of Lexington, Kentucky, that, as you said, really has struggled for the last several decades with kind of the decline of the coal industry. Everybody knows about some of the challenges in that area known as Appalachia. So he's done a great job doing it, and part of his idea was we need to create healthier fruits and vegetables. And so that the indoor greenhouse, now the largest indoor greenhouse in the country, allows you to do that. And also he saw an advantage to be in Kentucky because 70% of the U.S. population is within a 24-hour drive of where they are. So they can get those fruits and vegetables to the markets more quickly than if they're on one of the coasts. And also from a sustainability standpoint, it uses 90% less water. So it's good kind of in all respects. And he took that idea and ran with it. And that's an example of a rise rest company launching in a place that most people don't think startups launch, scaling to create significant jobs. And as you say, not just jobs for coders, but jobs for all kinds of people. And some of the other ones I mentioned before, like StockX or Shinola, similarly, have retrained auto workers to be working in their jobs, either manufacturing of things like watches in the case of Shinola, or doing the authentication that StockX does when people use their platform to buy and sell goods, sneakers, and other kinds of goods. They need to be authenticated, so they get sent to Detroit, and that's why they have 1,500 employees now for StockX, when it was essentially zero when the company started 5-6 years ago, and those are jobs in Detroit.
I remember when Greg was just hanging out at his they didn't have many employees when I went through. so hearing about it, I was like, yeah, that's phenomenal.
I was visiting Dan Gilbert at the time. We were talking about a bunch of things in Detroit, and he said, "I want to take you downstairs to show you the StockX thing." And we actually went to the basement of his building, and it was Greg and like a half a dozen other people just trying to figure out what to build here. And a couple of years I went back, and they had their own building, and now, as I said, they have 1,500 employees, multi-billion-dollar kind of valuation. So it's been a great investment for us. Probably close to 100x return so far, but also been a really positive contributor in terms of Detroit, and one of the many companies that's really helping to renew and revitalize Detroit. So it's a great example of the rise of rest.
When I started Venture for America, I was concerned about brain drain and also what was going on with the culture. And I think you hit on something in your book, which is to me in some ways the most important struggle that's going on. Is that when that entrepreneur who started AppHarvest, Jonathan, was talking to high schoolers in Kentucky, and he's trying to get them excited about environments in their area, excited about the possibility. There's this sense of optimism and can-do spirit that animates most entrepreneurs, and you characterize it as the American spirit, which it certainly has been for a long time. But there is this sense that that spirit may or may not be the same as it was. Like there's this kind of creeping pessimism, and your approach to trying to remedy that is to try and invest real money in real companies around the country to show people that these things can be built, which, by the way, I see as a very top-notch approach to try to rebuild the spirit of optimism and entrepreneurship. But do you sense the same things I do? Are you concerned that the can-do spirit of America is wavering or is being challenged?
No, I share the concern, and I think we have, unfortunately, and you know it well, kind of created this two Americas where there's some people in some places that are doing really well and excited by what's happening and kind of leaning into the future with great confidence and optimism. And many people, indeed most people, struggling and feeling left out and left behind, and that clearly has played out, as you saw firsthand, and even in our politics. So I understand that, and I also understand there's many facets to it. But our decision was to focus on one facet of it, which is trying to close this opportunity gap, trying to create more of a momentum in these communities, more hope in these communities, in part by creating more jobs in these communities and driving more economic growth in these communities. And by doing that, by backing new companies, backing entrepreneurs, backing startups. And as you mentioned, and we profiled, I think it's 30 cities, more than 40 companies in this book. It's not just the usual tech companies. There are these tech-enabled innovations across many different industry sectors, and many of these companies are, of course, creating some management jobs and some technology jobs, but also a lot of other jobs. And that's why companies like AppHarvest have 500 people, why companies like StockX have 1,500 people, and reversing that sense where the companies were in decline, the jobs were in decline, unemployment was going up, good paying jobs were going down. You know, Government maybe can play a role, certainly can play part of a role there, but ultimately I do believe it's the private sector, particularly the entrepreneurs, stepping up and starting companies in these places that create jobs and hope and opportunity in these places. And it's also worth pointing out for your listeners, you already know this, but it's not just about the jobs within these startups, within these new companies. There's a ripple effect across the community. For
Yep.
every startup job, there's 5 other jobs in the community, people building houses, people working in restaurants, all kinds of other jobs are created when you have a rising community. Conversely, when you have a declining community, you lose all those jobs. And that's why
Yep.
Detroit went from being the leading innovation city a century ago to over 50 years, last 50 years, losing 60% of its population and then going bankrupt. It went from being this magnet for talent and creating the auto industry and all the related supply chain companies, and then also creating the other related jobs in those communities. And then suddenly, when things reversed, it went into kind of free fall. So the reason Detroit is back and what's happening versus when you and I were first there a decade ago, the momentum in downtown Detroit is quite palpable. The buildings that were mostly empty a decade ago are now mostly full. Actually, there are cranes building new buildings to house some of the new companies that have been launched. That is creating more opportunity in a city like Detroit, and we're seeing this in the dozens of other cities that we've visited and invested in with Rise the Rest. So it does give me an optimistic view of America. I understand the problems, I understand the challenges, I understand why so many people are angry, frustrated, left out, left behind. But I think part of the answer has to be creating the opportunities, leading with new companies, leading with the industries of the future, not just doing that in a few places like Silicon Valley or New York City, doing that all across the country. I'm super excited by what we've seen just in the last few years. It feels like the momentum is building and things are really going to accelerate over the next years.
Oh yeah, you seem prescient now, man. Because I feel like talent has spread out and gone to all sorts of places that you've been championing or investing in for years. So the moment is definitely arriving. A couple of chapters in your book are about the nature of entrepreneurs. Where when you showed up in these cities initially, and by the way, I showed up in a lot of the same cities, and we both had the same experience, which is if you had a table of entrepreneurs, they were mostly white dudes.
Right.
And so then you're like, hey, we should try and broaden this out and change this up. And we both know that there are multiple obstacles for entrepreneurs from different backgrounds who are not, let's say, white men. If you're a woman, you have lower access to mentors, often lower access to seed capital and angel investors. The odds of your being invested in by a venture capitalist. What are the numbers on that? You must know
No, they're
the
pretty
percentage.
bad. The if you look at shift from place in the city that we've been talking about to people, here's the three statistics that should get your attention. Number one, women are 50% of the population. Female founders get less than 10% of venture capital. Number
That was the
two,
number.
Latinos are 19% of the population. They get less than 2% of venture capital. And Black Americans are 13% of the population, and they get less than 1% of venture capital. So this is not just a problem around place, with most of the capital going to places like California, New York, and Massachusetts. It's also about people. So we really need to level the playing field for place and for people, and make sure everybody who has an idea has a fair shot at creating a company, a fair shot, frankly, at the American dream. And what we've been doing in these cities is be intentional as we come to the cities and trying to reach out, understand the different aspects going on in each community, and make sure we're connecting with a diverse mix of founders. Even when we do pitch competitions in the city, we have a diverse mix of entrepreneurs pitching on stage. As a result of that intentionality, more than 40% of the investments we've made, I mentioned earlier, 200 investments to date, are female founders or founders of color, which still isn't what
Wow.
it should be, but it's quite a bit more than you see with traditional venture funds. And there really are terrific entrepreneurs in these cities, terrific entrepreneurs who come from different backgrounds, that do have different perspectives, that can imagine better ways to do things, which is, all entrepreneurs do is see a problem and turn it into an opportunity. And you're more likely to see a problem based on the life you live, and that gives certain people advantages. But we have to supplement that insight they have with the access to capital, mentorship, all the things you just mentioned, so they can take those ideas and run with them. And we can create a more inclusive innovation economy in this country, not just in terms of cities, but also in terms of people.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why there's a sense that I have. And so fun anecdote maybe. So you and I are presidential ambassadors of global entrepreneurship in the White House. And I'm watching HBO a number of weeks or months ago, and then a picture of you and me pops up, but it's not about you and me. It's because Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos is also in the picture, and and it's the documentary about her. I don't know if
Whoops,
you had this
whoops.
experience.
I did not see that.
Yeah. So anyway, if you watch the documentary, Steve, like you and I make a very brief cameo because they have like the
Hopefully
White
there's
House
no guilt
picture.
by association.
No. I mean, it was a blink and you miss it for us. But I mean, that passage of the documentary was about how Elizabeth Holmes was getting anointed and blessed and praised, and then meanwhile she was pulling a fast one. And that's not the only major movie about, I suppose, like the excesses of a particular entrepreneur. There's We Crashed about WeWork. There's the one about Uber and Travis Kalanick. Even a number of years ago, when you and I were working around the country, I think people viewed Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook differently than they do now. Like
Yep.
there were a bunch of things that have kind of turned culturally. And I think part of it is because of what you and I just described as well, which is a lot of the figures. I mean, Elizabeth Holmes is a woman, obviously, but a lot of the figures are white men, and there is like a sense that the excesses of entrepreneurship are something to be guarded against, which I'm sure you and I agree with. But to me, entrepreneurship like has, you know, 100 times more good than not good baked into it. like it's people
Right.
trying to go out and solve problems. And I felt like that's the way people saw entrepreneurship X years ago. But then there's been this cultural treatment over this last number of years that seems to be more dubious. I don't know if you've picked up on any of that, or whether maybe you don't watch the same TV I do. I don't know
No,
if
I
you have
think
that sense.
there's definitely some of that. I think some of it is while people in this country generally have celebrated the work of the pioneers that kind of that create new products, services, companies, and therefore kind of celebrate entrepreneurs. Lately, there has been a backlash. I think some of it is over this wealth gap that some of these people being worth tens of billions, or in some cases even several $100 billion, just doesn't seem right. And also, some of the innovations have taken a turn that concerns people. You mentioned Facebook, social media. I was a pioneer in that 35 years ago when we launched America Online. It was really first and foremost about community, chat rooms, instant messaging, things like that. And I always believed that one of the great opportunities for the internet was to kind of level the playing field in terms of access to information, ideas, commerce, other people, et cetera. But and things that have continued since then, like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, I think have largely been positives. But there's been a negative. There's been an unintended consequence, including the way some of the algorithms are used, which do help tend to elevate, some of the angry voices, and also there's concerns around how social media kind of works, and how people both on the internet and with cable television kind of live in their own filter bubbles, don't really get exposed to the other side of issues,
Yeah,
or just
information
hearing views
silos
that
for sure.
reinforce their own views. The silos. So that's been a unfortunate part of it. So I think that's all led to uh, a backlash against uh, some entrepreneurs, a backlash against technology, kind of a backlash against Silicon Valley, which doesn't really surprise me. Actually, you mentioned my previous book, The Third Wave, 6 years ago. I predicted there would be a backlash against Silicon Valley. I could see it. I could see it brewing. But what's happened in the last couple of years has been more than I would have expected. Again, I go back to what we talked about earlier. I think one way to address that is to recognize that part of the reason people are mad is because those entrepreneurs in places like Silicon Valley are creating these disruptive technologies that might be celebrated in Silicon Valley, but often mean job loss in their own community, in their own family. The technologies that drive productivity
Yeah,
are
if you're a random manufacturing worker in Michigan, you don't feel like you're benefiting
exactly.
from that. Yeah.
Yeah, the robotics company that's getting this big valuation and making the entrepreneur rich doesn't seem like it's helpful to you. So of course there's going to be a backlash. And the way I look at it is there's always going to be this march of technology. It's 100 years ago, 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's 2%. Because technology basically allowed you to grow more food with fewer people. That's actually a good thing if you want to feed the world. It was a bad thing for people working on farms, but thankfully, we were smart enough to retrain those people on farms to work in factories, and the industrial revolution took over from the agricultural revolution. But as you know, it's what you've written about, it's even why you ran for president. The transition from the industrial revolution to the digital revolution has not been as smooth, and it has dislocated a lot of people and hurt a lot of communities. So again, there's many facets to that. The one I chose to focus on was, well, how do we reverse that? Instead of job loss in communities, how do we create job growth in communities? And the only way to do it, in my opinion, the only sustainable way to do it, is to back new companies, some of which will fail, but some of which will end up being the Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow.
Yeah, thank goodness you are who you are doing what you're doing, Steve, because there's no one else doing what you're doing. I mean, it's funny, like you and I have been on these parallel journeys over the last decade or so. And then circa 2017, I said, you know what? So Trump
Yeah,
wins.
yeah,
I mean, you and I've been working in these communities for years. And when Trump wins, I was like, whoa, like, that this was a red flag for me. And I felt like I had an inkling as to why it was happening, because the opportunities were slipping away in so many parts of the country. And so then I went off in my direction, and then you got on the bus and went these communities and uplifted entrepreneurs and invested in them and did all these things. That's one reason it was so
yeah. We
much
both got on
genuine.
buses. You got on the bus in Iowa and New Hampshire running for president. I got on the bus trying to meet entrepreneurs all across the country. So we both hit the road on buses, but approaching it from a different lens and vantage point.
Yeah, thank you for that. I did have a bus in Iowa, and that was the only time in the campaign my kids thought I was cool. They had to come on a bus. They're like, "Dad has a bus." But yeah, so we went down these parallel tracks. Reading your book gave me some, uh, at least, glimpse into your last 5 years. What are you most excited about, most concerned about moving forward? You're on your second Rise of the Rest fund. You've cataloged all these awesome entrepreneurs. Like, what do you feel like is the next challenge? Because you are the quintessential entrepreneur, where you're just going to keep on building, growing, discovering, learning, and innovating.
Well, you're kind to say that. The way I think about it goes back to what I said earlier about my experience with AOL and the internet. The first decade was hard. We dealt with a lot of skepticism. A couple of times we almost hit the wall. We had to go through layoffs because we were running out of money. Most people didn't believe in the idea of the internet. Seems crazy now, but back then people would say, why do you think people are going to get on the internet? And why do you think people are going to use email when they can just pick up the phone and call somebody? Why do you think somebody's going to use e-commerce? Do they really think they're going to trust putting their credit card into the internet? I mean, there was all kinds of skepticism, and that continued for a decade, and that made it a difficult first decade. And then suddenly they hit a tipping point in the next decade. It went from an idea that nobody knew or cared about to everybody needed to get connected. That's when AOL went from a little company to a big company, and valuation when we went public in 1992 as the first internet company to go public was $70 million. 8 years later, it was $160 billion, the best performing stock of the decade. So to me, that was a reminder that sometimes revolutions happen in evolutionary ways. And sometimes if you persist, eventually you hit a tipping point. And I felt that in retrospect with the internet. First 10 years were hard. The second 10 years, things accelerated. And I feel the same way about the Rise of the Rest. I've been at this for a decade, as you mentioned. It's been a hard decade building out the foundation, trying to get people to believe in the idea of backing more people in more places. I think this next decade is when we really slam down the accelerator and accelerate backing more of these entrepreneurs and more of these places, where we join with some of the coastal investors to back these companies. And I think that's partly because investors now have their eyes more open to the opportunity to make money by backing these entrepreneurs in these places. And it's helped along by some policy I mentioned before, including the legislation that just passed Congress this last few months that's going to result in more of a focus on place-based strategy. Even Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, a few weeks ago talked about the need for place-based strategy. Essentially, the same things we've been saying as it relates to Rise the Rest. So we've made some progress in this last decade, but I think the real work is ahead. So we'll keep doubling down, trying to figure out ways to kind of extend our reach, extend our network, back more people, more places, get more capital as people, slow the brain drain of people leaving, accelerate the boomerang of people returning, do what we can to create more communities that are open to supporting entrepreneurs and not focused on the status quo, trying to lean into the future. That's my way, I think, of trying to contribute to this country, by trying to do what I can to from the prism of being an investor and maybe a private sector evangelist and occasionally a policy kibitzer, to try to have some impact. And oh, by the way, we started this conversation by talking about us both being on NACI, the National Advisory Council on Innovation Entrepreneurship. I'm back doing that again. When Gina Raimondo became
back.
Treasury Secretary, she asked for several recommendations of what to do, and one of them was focused on more regional expansion. So the regional hubs are part of that, and the other was to restart that NACI kind of group, which had kind of died during the Trump administration. So she agreed to restart it, but the deal was I had to chair it again. So I'm now
That's
co-chairing
what
that
happened, Steve.
with
You
Regina Johnson, who's
suggested
the
that
president of the
they
Ohio State University. Exactly. Be careful what you suggest. But I'm back in there focusing on some of the key priorities of the country from an innovation perspective, including making sure this regional hub investment goes well, including trying to make sure we're doubling down as a country on some of the industries of the future. So, a little bit of policy, continued focus on philanthropy, including the work you mentioned as chair of the Smithsonian. But most of my focus is on expanding Revolution, trying to help the rest rise, trying to help entrepreneurs navigate some of the policy challenges, which I think are going to create opportunities in a lot of sectors in this coming decade.
Thank goodness for you, Steve, putting in 10 years of work and then saying like, hey, now we're going to reap some rewards over the next 10 years. Most people don't think in those time frames, but that's the way you operate. And you're changing the lives not just of these entrepreneurs and the people that they'll employ and the 5X people that will be positively impacted because they'll have jobs in their communities, but you are rekindling the spirit of entrepreneurship in communities that need it, some of which may have lost it. And you say in your book that you think that's one of the paths to unity, and I couldn't agree more. If you had a prosperous culture and way of life in more parts of the country, then instead of being subject to, fighting and blaming, you'd actually look up and say, okay, what are the real problems and how can we solve them?
I agree. Again, I'm not saying it's the magic bullet. There are many things that need to be done in these communities, and many people, whether it be the government or nonprofits or others, need to play their role. Even the rebirth of Detroit, I mentioned what we've done from an investment standpoint, which I think has been helpful. I mentioned what Dan Gilbert did in terms of really going all in on investing in Detroit, which has been super helpful. Also, the leadership of foundations like the Kresge Foundation was catalytic. The leadership of the governor and the mayor was catalytic. It required everybody to do their part. I'm just focusing on one sliver of it, which I think is an important and catalytic sliver, which is creating more jobs and more economic growth in more places. As I do think that's one way, at least I can contribute to trying to knit together a very divided country and giving the country the best possible shot of continuing to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, even as we're seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship. And there's reasons to be concerned that maybe this next 250 years won't be as strong as the last 250 years. But rather than just sit back and complain about it or worry about it, I figured I'll do at least my part to do something about it. And for me, that's focused on Rise of the Rest.
Well, you're doing more than just about anyone. And you say in your book, as a fitting capstone, America's 250th birthday is going to be in 2026. And are we going to be celebrating in style? Or are we not?
We got to be. Let's stay optimistic, Andrew. Stay optimistic. No, I've been working on that. I start the book with that reference and end the book with that reference because I'm partly pulled into that because I am the chair of the Smithsonian. We have 19 museums on the National Mall, Air and Space, American history, natural history, and so forth. And I was at the 200th birthday of the country when I was still a teenager. That's when the Air and Space Museum opened in 1976. And I remember it. And so I want to make sure the 250th is equally memorable for the teenagers who might be there in 4 years, and is an opportunity for the Smithsonian to lead in the future and reach more people in more places. We have a whole strategy, virtual Smithsonian strategy around trying to be in every home and every classroom. And also we use this 250th birthday as an opportunity to renew that spirit, that can-do pioneering, kind of spirit that's made America America. And so that's what I'll work on towards that anniversary in 4 years, and some of that obviously ties in with what we've been talking about here with Rise Rest. Hopefully, we have at least a little bit more inclusive innovation economy when we turn 250, and we're on the path to really help more people and more places be part of the future and really live the American dream.
250 years young. That sounds like a party. I got to be there. Congratulations, Steve, on your work, first and foremost, but on a great book, Rise of the Rest. how entrepreneurs in surprising places are building the new American dream. Entrepreneurs need a champion, and you are one of the or the very best that America has. Thank you very, very much, my friend, for everything you do. Please say hey to Gene and the team for me.
I will do that. Thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about the book and for all you've done over the past decade, and look forward to continuing to work with you as we both do our part to make sure that this next chapter for America is a bright one.
Yeah, man, let's race towards this 2026 celebration. I'll see you there. It sounds
I'll
like it's
see
going
you
to
on the
be in
mall then.
DC.
Hopefully I'll see you before then.
Yeah, hopefully I'll see you before then. Thanks so much, Steve.
All right. Thanks.